Hi, Management 3500 students. This is Steve Wagner, and this is a series of brief videos on conflict and negotiations. So let's define conflict. Conflict is a process that begins when one party perceives another party has negatively affected or is about to negatively affect something that the first party cares about. So conflict primarily deals with perception. If nobody thinks there's a conflict, then no conflict exists. Conflict can be experienced in any organization. Conflict can be experienced in any organization through many different avenues. It can be that the goals of individuals are incompatible. There can be a difference of opinion, a difference of interpretation of facts, and many times conflict arise out of disagreements about how people should behave. So on that note, I do want to encourage you to also watch the video I have posted on crucial confrontations. This is a very good book about how to approach confrontations effectively. And if you look in the description of that video that I have on Blackboard, I've also attached to it a worksheet that you might find handy in the future when you're actually in a position where you may have to confront somebody. Now, there's been an evolution of how the management sciences on organizational behavior have viewed conflict. Traditionally, the view has been that conflict is something that's very negative and that we should go to ends to avoid conflict. And oftentimes, it was seen that conflict resulted from poor communication, a lack of openness, and failure to respond to the needs of employees. And certainly, there have been many interventions that people have used to try and improve communication and openness and understanding of employee needs. Now, in after World War II through the 1970s, there was this kind of human relations view that started to emerge that saw conflict as something that was perhaps something that was natural and inevitable in any group. And there was also this view of had this interactionist approach that the belief that conflict is not only a positive force in a group, but that is absolutely necessary for a group to perform. We saw that in Tuckman's model of how groups develop. Now, through all of this different ways of thinking about conflict, we have to see and understand that there may be some conflict that is functional, and that it's conflict in support of some higher, perhaps strategic goal that actually improves the performance of the organization in terms of reaching its goals. But there is also this dysfunctional conflict that is a barrier to group performance and a barrier to an organization achieving its strategic goals. Now, other efforts have been made to differentiate various kinds of conflict. We can differentiate between task conflict, which is conflict over the content of the work and the goals. And if this type of conflict is kept low to a moderate level, it can be functional. There is relationship conflict. This is conflict based on interpersonal relationships and also conflict in terms of one's identity and one's ego. And generally, we find this conflict to be more often than not, as the slides say, always dysfunctional. And then there's process conflict. That's not about what we're trying to achieve, what goal we're trying to achieve, but how we're going to get how we're going to achieve that. And again, it can be conflict, but only at very low levels. Now, the trick here is we can see that the research suggests that task conflict and process conflict can be functional if kept at low levels. Okay, and that relationship conflict is almost always dysfunctional. But what's hard to do is to keep conflict contained into just one of these categories. And oftentimes, conflict very quickly moves and spills over into relationship conflict because of the assumptions that people take on when they get into a conflict situation. If you want to try and manage a situation to achieve task conflict and process conflict at low but functional levels, you have to go out of your way to structure the situation to avoid relationship conflict. Okay, and again, just to call out to that crucial confrontations video and worksheet, the whole point of that is structuring things in a way to keep it's focused on the task conflict and the process conflict. Now let's take a deeper look at the conflict process. So understanding this conflict process is part of our tool set in understanding how to manage conflict. Okay, and so we'll go through these various stages step by step. Stage one of the conflict process is the potential opposition or incompatibility that exists. So there has to be a perception of some kind of opposition or incompatibility. So in this stage, there's three main conditions that can cause conflict to arise. They are communication, structure, and then personal variables. Communication can cause conflict when words mean different things to different people, or they are misunderstandings that result from that. Communication can be functional to a point, but when there's too much communication, there can be frustrations, and sometimes there are barriers in place to effectively hear what is communicated. Structure can cause conflict when people are confused about their roles or the amount of authority that they have. If goals are not well defined, or different for different group members, then that can cause conflict. Also, leadership styles may cause conflict if it is not a style that group members respond to very well. Reward system and also dependency issues can also be sources of conflict. Personal variables will cause conflict when there are different value systems represented, or when there are different personality variables that put people at odds. These factors can bring about conflict and set the stage for conflict to occur. Stage two looks at the recognition or the cognition of conflict and the personalization or the emotional part of that conflict. So as we stated earlier, in order for conflict to be present, there must be an awareness that there is the existence of some opposition or some incompatibility. This is defined as perceived conflict. Once people are aware of the conflict, emotions begin to be expressed that can impact how the conflict escalates. This is defined as felt conflict. Emotions, including tension, hostility, frustration, anxiety, all of these things can be part of that felt conflict. Now, stage three looks at the intentions of the people involved in the conflict. Intentions include how someone intends to act, but it's important to realize that behavior isn't always directly following from someone's intentions. Sometimes people act out of emotion and not rational thinking. Now, there are competing dimensions of conflict handling intentions. One can be motivated by cooperativeness or attempting to satisfy someone else's concerns. And the other dimension is assertiveness, attempting to satisfy your own concerns. As the slide shows, there are different variations on these two competing claims. And so in this week's Experiencing OB assignment, you're going to have a self-assessment on your negotiation style. And the self-assessment gives you a series of questions to tell whether your dominant style for conflict is one of these 5 styles. It's important to know that as a manager because, again, when you go into a conflict situation, and that may just be part of your job, you should be clear about your intentions in that situation and not be ruled solely by emotions. By knowing your dominant response to a conflict situation, you can pause and diagnose whether your dominant response is appropriate for this particular situation, or whether you need to coach yourself or get coaching from someone else to take on a different type of approach that, while may be appropriate for the situation, is not your particular dominant response. Now, stage 4 moves us beyond the intentions to the actual conflict behaviors. Conflict management is using behavior as a way to resolve conflict when it is present. Conflict intensity, as is displayed here, is a continuum that shows how far conflict can escalate and how low it can get to where there is no conflict. Again, what we find is that conflict has a tendency to escalate. One of the main reasons we find that conflict tends to escalate is that we are, in general, ruled by a norm of reciprocity. We give what we get. Okay, but in both vicious cycles and virtuous cycles, we tend to operate in what's called rough reciprocity. That means that we give what we get, but a little bit more. Okay, and when we're giving back things that are negative, okay, and a little bit more, that's more like a vicious cycle. Okay, when we give something to the other party that is positive, perhaps a concession that's important to them, that can be part of a virtuous cycle. Now, there are many different techniques available to help work through conflict, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are all things that are described in this chapter and other parts of the book. And so each technique chosen needs to not just be applied blindly, but always there should be real consideration of the particulars of the situation where the conflict exists, the people that are involved, their history, in order for any conflict resolution technique to be effective. In stage 5, we look at the outcomes of conflict resolution. And functional outcomes include an increase in group performance, an encouragement of the interests and curiosity and creativity in that group. Dysfunctional outcomes include people being discontent, a lower level of group cohesiveness or unity, and perhaps even infighting. And in order to create functional conflict, it's important that we give room for dissent, and we also try and keep people from spilling over into relationship conflict.